Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from Antiwar.com, and this is Anti-War News for Thursday, August 4th. The top story at Antiwar.com is more Nancy Pelosi news. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi departed Taiwan on Wednesday for South Korea and left in her wake soaring tensions between Taipei and Beijing as the Chinese military is preparing unprecedented military exercises that will effectively blockade the island. So, China's People's Liberation Army, the PLA, I touched on this yesterday. They're closing off 6 areas around Taiwan from Thursday to Sunday that will effectively amount to a military blockade or a soft blockade. And they're expected to hold drills, including live fire exercises, within 12 nautical miles of the island of Taiwan. Now, a country's territorial waters, as defined by international law, extends from the coast out 12 miles. And same with the country's airspace. And that's an area China typically does not enter. So this is a new step that they're taking in response to this provocation from Nancy Pelosi. And both Chinese and American analysts believe that the unprecedented military exercises could become routine as a consequence of Pelosi's visit. So I link here to an article in the Global Times, Chinese English language state media outlet, and they quote analysts and that say that this is going to become routine, blockading the island. I also linked to an article in the Wall Street Journal that quoted U.S. analysts who said the same thing. And we've seen that U.S. delegations visiting the island in the past have led to routine Chinese military activity. We've seen an increase in Chinese warplanes just flying in the area, not near Taiwan. You often see headlines in Western media that say Chinese warplanes enter Taiwan's airspace, but that's not true. They enter an area called an Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, which is not defined under international law. But and the planes usually stay pretty far from Taiwan. Usually they're closer to mainland China than Taiwan, but it makes for a snappy headline to frankly just lie about it and say that it's airspace. But, the people that write these articles don't really know what they're talking about. But yeah, this is unprecedented. This is going to mark the largest Chinese exercises around Taiwan since the Third Taiwan Strait crisis that was sparked in 1995 by the U.S. granting a visa to former Taiwanese President Lee Teng-hui. China has also imposed sanctions on Taiwan because of Pelosi's visit, including a ban on the export of natural sand to the island and a halt on imports of fish and fruit products from Taiwan. Now, during her brief visit, Pelosi met with Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen. She visited the island's parliament and met with Taiwan's leading chip manufacturers. During her meeting with Tsai, Pelosi said, "The U.S. will not abandon our commitment to the island." Now, the U.S. hasn't had formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan since 1979 when they formally opened with Beijing, and they currently have no commitment to defend Taiwan if China attacks. It's a policy known as strategic ambiguity, but there are hawks in Washington that are looking to drastically change America's Taiwan policy, including Senator Rick Scott, a Republican from Florida. He was the last member of Congress to visit the island before Pelosi. He was there in early June and met with President Tsai, and she thanked him for introducing the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act. And that's a bill that would give the president war powers to go to war with China if they attack Taiwan. It's really would be just a huge escalation in U.S. policy towards Taiwan if that ever passed. But luckily, it hasn't had much momentum. Not many people have gotten behind it because it is would be such a big change. But so in recent years, we've seen congressional delegations to Taiwan become more frequent. And I put a quote in here from Raymond Green. He's the deputy head of the de facto U.S. embassy in Taipei. They don't have a regular embassy. It's mostly either former officials are there or some kind of, scholars or something that act as diplomats, de facto diplomats for the U.S. So Raymond Green, last year, he said how U.S. policy has changed for Taiwan and China. He said, quote, "The United States no longer sees Taiwan as a problem in our relations with China. We now see it as an opportunity to advance our shared vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, end quote. So that basically means Taiwan's not an issue for our relations with China now. It's an opportunity to counter China, to confront China. And I think Pelosi's trip provoked China enough that the US is going to start beefing up its military in the region, pointing to these exercises that were sparked by Pelosi visiting. Okay, so the next one, more Nancy Pelosi. While she was in Taiwan, she met with the island's top semiconductor industry leaders as the US is looking to gain an edge on China when it comes to chip manufacturing. Her trip came after Congress passed the CHIPS and Science Act, which is a massive $280 billion piece of legislation, and it includes $52 billion to subsidize domestic chip manufacturing. The rest of the money, the 200 something billion, is just going to US federal agencies for research. I mean, it's very vague what that funding is for. Um, and it seems like the focus of this bill is on the chips, but I think I should look more into this other funding. So Pelosi met with the chairman of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, and that is the world's biggest chip manufacturer. And they met to discuss the CHIPS and Science Act. We don't know the details of the meeting, but the meeting itself signals that the US is looking to entice TSMC to open more facilities in the US with the subsidies included in the legislation. TSMC is currently building a $12 billion semiconductor facility in Arizona, which is expected to be operational by 2024. And this looks like the US wants more. Pelosi said while in Taiwan that the CHIPS Act means the US and Taiwan can increase their cooperation. Taiwan is the world's largest chip manufacturer. That's where most of them are made. And this is all about China, that the US is trying to compete its chip production with China. And another part of this strategy is sanctions. They've been hitting China with sanctions to try to deny them some of the technology that is needed to manufacture chips. They are pressing a Netherlands based company and a Japanese based company not to sell certain technology to China that they need to make semiconductors. China has denounced this as what they call technological terrorism. But US sanctions, as often the case, appear to have backfired as China's chip industry is now the fastest growing in the world. Since the US started targeting China with these sanctions, it really sparked innovation inside China to get their domestic chip manufacturing going. And according to Bloomberg, 19 now after these sanctions, 19 of the world's 20 fastest growing chip industry firms over the past 4 quarters on average are in China. And I also mention here because we've seen a lot of news about Nancy Pelosi is always accused of insider trading, and her husband's stock activity is pretty scrutinized. And Paul Pelosi, her husband, I really hope I don't have to do much more Pelosi news. I'm getting sick of talking about her. But her husband, he bought stocks in an American chip company before Congress was set to vote on the CHIPS Act. So that raised red flags for a lot of people. But then he actually sold 25,000 of those shares. He dumped them the day before the House passed the CHIPS bill. So I don't know what that means. But overall, the global semiconductor stocks took a hit due to Pelosi's trip and the uncertainty that it caused. Okay. So the next one, the Senate votes 95-1 to expand NATO into Sweden and Finland. And this really demonstrates the bipartisan consensus on expanding the military alliance further on Russia's border. Finland shares an over 800-mile border with Russia. That country joining NATO more than doubles NATO's frontier with Russia. So again, the measure passed in a vote of 95-1, with only Senator Josh Hawley, Republican from Missouri, voting no. And then Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, he voted present, which is disappointing to see that only Hawley was the one that voted no. I mean, 95-1, that's pretty dismal. And even Hawley's reasons weren't very good. In an op-ed published in the National Interest, He explained that he was against expanding NATO into Sweden and Finland because he believes the US should be expanding its military resources into the Asia Pacific to counter China. Hawley has introduced a piece of legislation in 2021. I forget the exact number, but it would have given Taiwan billions in military aid each year. So he's a big proponent of the U.S. focusing on China. And Rand Paul, he tried to add an amendment to the resolution that would have emphasized that NATO's Article 5, which is the mutual defense clause of the alliance, it says that an attack on one member is an attack on all. So Paul, he tried to get this amendment in there that would say that that doesn't supersede the need for congressional authorization for war. But the amendment failed in a vote of 10 to 87. So that's also pretty dismal. So the Senate vote was needed to ratify U.S. approval. The Senate had to ratify Sweden and Finland joining the alliance because it's expanding a treaty. And all 30 NATO members need to approve the Nordic nations' memberships. And according to The Hill, the Senate vote makes the U.S. the 20th country to do so. In July, there was a House resolution supporting their NATO bid, Sweden and Finland. That passed in a vote of 394 to 18, with only Republicans voting against it. So Turkey is the only NATO member that has said that its legislature could block Sweden and Finland from joining the alliance. If you remember, Turkey initially blocked them from applying, blocked the application process because they accuse Sweden and Finland of supporting the PKK, which is a Kurdish militant group that Turkey considers a terrorist organization. During the NATO summit in Madrid back in June, Turkey signed a 10-point memorandum with Sweden and Finland and lifted their objection. A big part of that memorandum said that Sweden and Finland will cooperate with Turkey, or it said that will respond to Turkey's extradition requests. And Turkey renewed its extradition requests. It's mostly suspected PKK members and people from other groups. Now, it seems like Erdogan, the Turkish president, has kind of said that if they don't let us extradite all these people, then they're not getting into NATO. But the memorandum that they signed didn't say explicitly that they had to agree to extradite these people. It said that they would respond and cooperate on their extradition requests. So we'll see what happens with this. That's the only roadblock that they have to joining NATO, and that would expand the alliance. It would make it a 32-member alliance. So the next one here, the U.S. plan to cap Russian oil price draws more skepticism. So Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has been pushing this idea to put a price cap on Russian oil because sanctions have totally backfired on the West. Russia is profiting more off oil sales now than they did before the war. And the idea of the plan would to be to limit Russia's profit without driving up global oil prices, because if you take Russian oil off the market, prices are going to skyrocket. And also, this is also damage control for EU sanctions that are going to take effect at the end of the year. The EU agreed on a ban of Russian oil that will come into effect at the end of the year, with exemptions for Hungary. But also, besides banning the import of Russian oil, it will sanction. It won't allow insurers to give insurance to shipments of Russian oil, and Russia relies on insurers in the EU and in Britain to ship its oil. Now, it's something that they'll be able to find alternatives, but there will definitely be an initial shock from them losing their insurance to ship their oil, and that's going to send prices, soaring probably. I'm not sure how high or what the estimates are for that. So they're really scrambling. And the idea of this price cap would be to set it at this level, and then insurance companies would be allowed to insure the shipments if they know that it's being shipped at that set price. But the New York Times reported on Wednesday that shipping insurers don't think the plan is enforceable. They quote a shipping insurer who basically says it won't work. We're not going to be able to, if we ask them for proof of how much the oil was bought for. Basically, they could just show us whatever they want. So Yellen's still pushing the price cap despite the fact that there's so much skepticism and so many experts are warning against it because Russia could retaliate. Really, it's doomed to fail because it relies on Russia cooperating. If the US tries to impose this cap and Russia says no and decides to cut off countries that try to put this cap on Russia and they cut oil production, then oil prices could really skyrocket because that's a response. An official with the Russian central bank said that Russia would probably just cut production pretty drastically if they try to impose this cap. And it also requires the cooperation of China and India, who are buying a ton of Russian oil now already at a discount. They have no reason to rock the boat with Moscow. And last month, we saw analysts at JP Morgan Chase. They warned that if Russia responded by cutting oil production in the worst case scenario, oil prices could soar to $380 per barrel, which imagine that right now they've been hovering around $100. Then we would really be feeling the pain at the pump. So, I mean, if they go through with that plan, it's just completely reckless and it's just going to be a disaster. And I'm surprised that they're still pushing it. Next one. Oh, I left up from yesterday. The U.S. approved this massive arms deal for Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The State Department approved it, over $5 billion for Patriot missiles and THAAD missiles. The next one here. Now, this is you talk about every day. There's just these escalations of tensions with nuclear armed countries, and here's another one. This is according to a report from the Daily Beast, that the U.S. and South Korea are planning new war games where they will simulate taking out North Korea's military leadership, including the country's leader, Kim Jong-un. So the U.S. is risking provoking Kim by doing these war games. The last time that they were held was in 2017, and Kim responded by ordering an underground nuclear weapons test. And that was the last time that the North carried out a nuclear test. But now, as they're restarting these massive war games, that the last time they were held, 50,000 South Korean troops were involved and 20,000 U.S. troops participated. It's just such a big provocation toward the North. And they decided to hold these drills again because South Korea's new president, Yoon, he was elected earlier this year and came into office, and he's vowed to take a more hawkish stance on the North as opposed to his predecessor, Moon Jae-in, who was a proponent of peaceful reunification. And we saw some progress in that direction under Trump. We saw the North and South talking. Trump met with Kim, but it was ultimately sabotaged by hawks in the Trump administration, and it didn't get anywhere. So now that we have Yoon, and he wants the U.S. to send nuclear weapons back to South Korea. The U.S. took all their strategic nuclear weapons off the Korean Peninsula in 1991. He wants them to return. But sources told the Daily Beast that the drill will simulate targeting Pyongyang's missile and nuclear sites, plus bases needed to supply them. And then the war games will end with what they call a decapitation exercise, where they attack North Korea's command structure and take out Kim. So another provocation from the U.S. that's going to lead to an escalation of tensions in Asia. And South Korea, I think the U.S. has big plans for their military. They want them to play a role in working against China. And if Yoon wants to be more hawkish towards the North, I think the Biden administration is going to just go right along with it. And we've seen the Biden administration say that they're open to talks with Pyongyang, but they haven't offered any incentives to bring them to the table. They still call for a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And what we saw, one idea that was explored by the Trump administration, granted it didn't get very far, was instead of denuclearization, how about a nuclear freeze in exchange for some sanctions relief to get everybody to the table, to get everybody talking. But, we're just so far away from that happening again. Okay, so the last one, this is from Jason Ditz. So Iran, the U.S., and the EU, they're returning to Vienna for nuclear deal talks. They've held talks there that were unsuccessful, and this comes after the EU has proposed a draft text for the Iran nuclear deal. We're not sure of the details, if it lays out what sanctions the U.S. should lift and what steps Iran should take. So we'll see what happens here. I mean, the envoys are returning. Robert Malley, President Biden's envoy for Iran, who's been pretty bad at his job because we haven't seen any progress in this arena, is going back there. My hopes aren't very high because the U.S. has been so stubborn, and Biden has just really failed at any sort of rapprochement with Iran because we're just escalating with everybody. So that's it for today. We have a lot of good viewpoints as always, including one from Chaz Freeman about Biden's trip to the Middle East. That's very good. And he's an important voice to listen to. I think he's most known for his role in the President Nixon's trip to China in 1972. He served as the chief interpreter for that trip. So that is it for today. Thank you for joining me. I'll be back tomorrow. You can contact the show, news@antiwar.com. Support the show at antiwar.com/donate. Subscribe on YouTube and Odyssey, and download it on your favorite podcast app. I hope everybody has a good one, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thank you.